for tonight, if you look at the handout that says A Tiny Nation, this is where we're going to spend the meat of our time. We're doing pretty well. We've done our first 12 minutes. I'm going to take about 15 minutes with this, and then we're going to talk about the timeline and the structure of the books, and I'm going to try to leave the last 10 minutes open for question and answer. So first of all, A Tiny Nation. In Deuteronomy 7 through 8, I put it underneath the caption. The Lord did not choose you because you were the greatest from among the nations, for you were the least. No, it was because the Lord loved you and has kept the oath he swore to your ancestors. So the first thing to understand, well, the reason I call it a tiny nation, one, they were not the most numerous of people, they were not the most established, they were not the most impressive. Living in the rough part of town, first thing you got to understand is that Israel, so you've got Africa here, you've got the Middle East here, they're kind of on the road to several major empires, including Assyria and Babylon, these huge empires for their time, and Israel was in their way to like paths of conquest going this way and that way, so they were at a crossroads, and so in that sense, they had some really big enemies. And then, I'm sure you guys have seen, they had Amalekites and Hizrites and Jebusites and thisites and thatsites. Well, it was a really rough world. The American concept of the lone wolf doesn't really work in a world that rough. So you had bands, anywhere from dozens to hundreds to thousands, of essentially the closest thing we have are gangs. They stuck together and they preyed on others rather than cultivating their own resources. And so in the rough part of town, isn't just that you had a couple of major establishments you had to try to avoid, but you also had a lot of roaming bands to try to defend yourself from. So it was a tiny nation living in the rough part of town, and in parentheses I wrote in my notes, but with a very big God. And so let's go to the first subheader. Who was an Israelite? We tend to think an Israelite is like purely an ethnic thing, like black or Asian or whatever. But the truth is, particularly during the Exodus, when all the people left Egypt, there were a lot of other people groups that went with them. So what made somebody an Israelite and what made somebody not an Israelite? And so under here, a Moabite is not necessarily of Moab, but can be someone in whom there is Moab. So this is part of the reason why you'll read at some points in the Bible why treaties with other nations were so bad. It's because when you made treaties with other nations, a lot of times that meant you brought their gods into your temple and you worshiped them as well. It meant that Israel was not just being Israel anymore, they were being this other nation in their culture and their practices as well. The closest thing we have in our society to that would be, for example, corporate culture, Hollywood culture, the media. These are things that live with us every day and can very easily infect us with their mind frame. And I don't just mean like the pursuit of money. A corporate mindset treats everybody like a thing. We are a commodity that can be used and replaced. That mindset, when we use that on people, that is like bringing in the foreign gods of another culture into your temple. In the same way with Hollywood, the pursuit of celebrity, who got the latest plastic surgery, who's hooking up with who, and so on. It's the same kind of thing. They also had a lot of what were called high places, and you'll hear references to Asherah poles and the Baal worship and all of that. And so if you try to think in terms of Hollywood culture, media culture, corporate culture, these are all things that we're living mixed in with right now. So if a Moabite is not necessarily of Moab, but someone in whom there is Moab, then when you see someone being referred to specifically as the Moabite or the Ashkelite or whatever, the text is trying to tell you they are set against Israel, that they are not a part of what Israel is about. So for example, in the book of Ruth, Ruth was technically from Moab, but although she was from Moab, she called the God of Israel her own. And she ultimately became King David's, and I made a mistake in the text, it's great-grandmother, not grandmother. But still, ancestor of King David and ultimately ancestor of Jesus. Jesus has a Moabite ancestor. And the reason he has a Moabite ancestor is because she told Naomi, her mother-in-law, that your God will be my God. She went to Israel, she married an Israelite, she became of Israel. So if you'll see here this diagram, these radiating circles in the center. So you've got a family of origin, And then you've got the clan, the tribe, and the people. Now, the reason this matters so much, we're going to get in the next section about how there wasn't a lot of strong defense. So the basic building block people used for protection was the family. You had your family of origin, and you looked out for each other. You kind of enforced the rule of law. You had your patriarch. And then you had your extended family, what we would now think of as cousins, aunts, uncles, great-grandparents, great-aunts, and so on. And they were kind of our clan. Well, in the Old Testament, tribe, so you descend from one of the patriarch's kids, whether it's, Issachar, Naphtali, Zebulun, Dan, Benjamin, Judah. And so the reason that's important is because it did play a role, particularly with Aaron and King David. Aaron was Moses' brother. The priesthood had to descend in the Old Testament biologically from Aaron. A lot of the genealogies that you see have to do with proving that you come from the patriarchs if you're going to take certain official positions in Israel. So if you look on the right, being of Israel is more than just a lineage, though, even with Israel's kings and priests, but also it's about one's relationship with God. And I went ahead and quoted here Exodus 22, 20 through 21. Anyone who sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed, but you must not mistreat or oppress foreigners in any way, for you yourselves were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. You have two verses right next to each other that say you got to wipe out anybody who worships foreign gods, but don't mistreat basically the sojourner, the alien, the stranger. In the Old Testament and in the New, you often had what were called proselytes, people who came from other cultures, genetically not of Israel, who had taken on the worship of Israel's God and had decided to become part of the culture. They were generally not considered enemies. That being said, you will find that sometimes there was a clash of ethnic pride with their spiritual mission. Genesis 22:18, basically, God tells Abraham that I'm going to bless the nations through you. Israel was in many ways God's... Back in the day when you wanted to make bread that had yeast in it, you would take a lump of dough that had raised, that had yeast in it, and you would mix it into the dough you're making so that it will raise too. So in many ways, Israel was the leaven for the bread. Or if you want a more modern analogy, a couple sessions ago I referred to Abraham as God's startup money for a going concern. Abraham was one of the first people that not only listened to God, but sustained a family that would listen to God, that then had families that listened to God. Well, in the same way that God used Abraham as startup cash, to start a culture, his goal with Israel was to make Israel the startup cash to spread the worship of God to the other nations, which we did finally see realized in Jesus. But much of the Old Testament can vex you if you're not understanding it's not going to happen right away. This is going to take time, and he's going to work through people. So as far as sacrifices go, if you try to just pick up the Bible and read it through, particularly in the first 5 books, you're going to read a lot about how to make sacrifices. And it can get a little dizzying, a little confusing. So the only thing I'll tell you is this. People did that kind of thing a lot back then. Sacrifice animals and burn them. But the way it happened in the Old Testament was different. I'll give you an analogy. If I say university professor or going to college, you have a mental image of sitting in rooms like this with a guy up here, textbooks and lectures and a syllabus. Well, in that sense, the systems were similar. But you also know that when you go to study economics, that's a very different class than, say, studying the Bible. And this is similar to what's happening in the sacrificial system, is God is using something they understood, but with a different tone, a different intent. So instead of these sacrifices being a way of buying God's favor, they were a way of saying thank you to God for his favor. Just to give you an example. Because it's always about the miracle and the relationship, not about the magic and the incantation. There is never in the Old Testament a time where anything gives you the idea that they can make God do anything or that they have to do it a certain way to get God to do what they want. Matter of fact, at several points, God makes a point of showing them, oh, you thought you could lead, the Ark of the Covenant into your fight so you'd win against the Philistines? Well, guess what? That's not going to work. And so they have to run for their lives. So that kind of covers who our Israelite is. It is a combination of a relationship with God, and in some cases a genealogy and more technical understanding is necessary. But it was very unusual to have a culture that just let people in the way it did back then.